Welcome to Some Stutter Law, Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast about communicating differently. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we are known for speaking with local flair. We know that we speak some colorful dialects. We use words like ducky, muzzy, and shook, and we loves it, law. But there are millions of people around the world who communicate in ways often dismissed. I'm one of them. I'm a person who stutters, and for some reason our disfluent words get disregarded, stigmatized, and labeled as a speech disorder. Well, I've got news for you. Some folks stutter law. It's time to embrace all forms of communicative diversity and disabilities that influence how people communicate. And that's what Some Stutter Law is all about. Some Stutter Law welcomes Professor Benjamin Munson. Ben is a professor of the Department of Speech Language Hearing Sciences, University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. So welcome to Some Stutter Law, Ben.
Thank you, Greg. It's really nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation and that incredibly touching introduction. That's quite moving.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate that. So, Ben, would you elaborate a little on how your work? I mean, work with languages intersects with the clinical speech therapy, audiology, social linguistics, psycholinguistics, and social justice.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fascinated by language my entire life. I grew up in Buffalo, New York in the 1970s and 1980s. And my parents made the very conscious decision to raise their families in the city in, neighborhoods that were far more diverse than the neighborhoods my mother and my father had grown up in. My father was rural. My mother was from a, working class factory family. Her father worked at Westinghouse. They wanted their kids to be exposed to far more diversity in terms of racial diversity in gender and sexuality. And that meant linguistic diversity as well. So I attended a social justice magnet school in the Buffalo Public Schools in the 1970s and 80s. And, the school was majority Black. And, there was a lot of African-American English that was used there. And sort of understanding the landscape of linguistic diversity was just part of my earliest memories of life. And because of that, I was interested in language and, language variation, sociolinguistic variation, very, very early in life. And it just has stuck with me. Whenever I've thought I might do something else, I always come back to it. I ended up in speech language pathology. It's a long personal history that will bore your listeners, but I ended up in speech language pathology after starting out in linguistics. And it, in some ways it is like the perfect field. In other ways, it's the perfect storm. And when I say it's the perfect field, what I mean is that, it is a field that is ripe for work that, sort of values language variation and, embraces language variation and its sort of sociolinguistic functions. It's also a field that has traditionally sharply disregarded language variation and very much enforced linguistic uniformity, as you yourself have experienced, as you narrated in your introduction. And so, as someone who has sort of a lifelong commitment to linguistic variation, understanding linguistic variation, cherishing linguistic variation, who ended up in speech language pathology, it seems just natural that my work would intersect speech language pathology, audiology, social justice, sociolinguistics, and psycholinguistics.
Okay, so Ben, did you work as a speech language pathologist for a while?
So I have my clinical master's in speech language pathology, and that requires a couple hundred, I think it was 375 clinical hours during the master's degree. And then after that, I continued to provide services when I was in my PhD program, but I never got my final license. So I never got my certificate of clinical competence in speech language pathology. I did, did a lot of mentored clinical work and have continued to do clinical research, but I've never been out in the field the way that I suspect many of your guests from speech language pathology have been.
Okay. Now, does many of your students, Ben, go on to become speech language pathologists?
Yes, the vast
Yeah.
majority of my
Okay.
students. So, we have undergraduate students who are, that's a pre-professional degree. You can't be a speech language pathologist, at least not a sort of regular speech language pathologist with just an undergraduate degree in the US. But many of those people, I'd say at least 2/3, go on to a graduate program in speech language pathology or audiology. 100% or close to it of our master's students in speech language pathology become speech language pathologists. Most of our PhD students, and that's a much smaller program. Most of our PhD students are audiologists or speech language pathologists who are coming back to begin a career in research. So right now, of the 3 PhD students I'm working with in the department, 2 of them worked for many years as speech language pathologists before getting their PhDs.
Excellent, excellent. So, Ben, wondering now. You, you mentioned that speech language pathology can be a perfect storm. Would you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I mean, could I elaborate a little bit on it? I'm not.
Or a
I'm not
lot, a
sure I
lot,
can elaborate a little bit on it. I'm
a
not
lot.
known for being concise. So I guess what I'd say is, if you look back at the history of speech language pathology, and sort of take a critical eye to it, as people like Joshua St. Pierre, who is a professor out in the Canadian prairies, I think he's
Hmm.
in Edmonton or Calgary, have done, or people like Judy Duchan and Lynn Hewitt in University of Buffalo and around there have done in looking at the history of speech language pathology. You see that the profession really has functioned to enforce linguistic uniformity, right? And so one of the painful ways that has, well, there are many painful ways that has played out in the past. One of the painful ways that is very much reminiscent of the linguistic landscape of my upbringing is the way that speech language pathology treated African American language as essentially disordered, as something that needs to be corrected and fixed and sort of homogenized to be like the mainstream white culture, right? But the experience of folks who stutter is very reminiscent of that as well. So rather than saying some people stutter, and people need to develop better strategies to listen and participate in communications with folks whose fluency may differ from their own. Instead, it has been speech language pathology has been about enforcing a particular standard of fluency as the norm and putting the responsibility on the person who stutters to change or mask or hide or adapt, rather than putting the focus on society to change what it values and to embrace a wider range of ways of languaging.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, Ben. So then, Ben, what would be the gap here, like in terms of I'm thinking about my history, because I've always had a severe stutter. I always classify myself as a severe stutterer, and so remember, so my way of dealing with my stutter was I actually started to mask it. I sort of hit it. The old tricks of the trade, like substitute, word substitution, avoid social gatherings, introducing myself. So I actually became a covert stutterer, which unfortunately that causes a lot of, that sort of adds to the fire, and besides the physical characteristics of stuttering as well as the emotion component, it adds to the emotion both, really, because you're trying to do your best to hide it. So I became a covert stutterer. But so when I decided that, because I realized later in life that I was spiraling into a dark rabbit hole of fluency sort of thing. I was fighting against accepting stuttering, and then I thought, no, I have to do something because my quality of life was out of control. So I went to I tried speech therapy, and I was very fortunate because I sort of attended it's called the Fluency Plus program through the Toronto Speech and Stuttering Institute, and so that helped me manage my stuttering. But I find that, I mean, the more that I'm involved with the stuttering community, the more that I've sort of become more familiar with the challenges people who stutter face in terms of acceptance. For some reason or another, I have a difficulty with the F word. I call the F word fluency. And so I find that I think you also mentioned, as we talked about earlier, that speech pathology. I feel for speech language pathologists at this point in my life, because they're being challenged a great deal about moving from the clinical component of stuttering to the more emotional, to put more emphasis. And I think there's a gap here.
Yeah.
But there's still this pressure on people who stutter, I think. And also, we're our fault. We put ourselves, put a lot of pressure on ourselves to fit in, to be fixed, and just to be fluent. And so, what are your thoughts about this?
Many. My thoughts about this are many. And they're, please rein me in because, I could do a real brain dump here.
Oh no, that's okay.
Um,
This is your time, Ben.
I think this conversation brings to my mind, and I admit that this is something that it is often on my mind, is how readily people associate the way that an individual uses language with their kind of worth as a human being, right? And so, if you think about it, like even the word dumb, right, which has both the meanings of the kind of archaic meaning, but of not speaking, and the meaning of not intelligent, right? Um, if you look at even popular discourse about the worth of different groups of people, the worth of groups of people who are disregarded in society is often sort of along with a portrayal of those people as not using language properly, right? So there's a lot of ableist rhetoric about this, and there's a lot of racist rhetoric about this as well, right? And so I think one of the gaps that exists, first of all, is that speech language pathology as a field, and frankly, I would say linguistics until quite recently as a field as well, hasn't really addressed this issue of of how we have contributed to this societal discourse about someone's language being an indicator of their worth as a human being. And here I point the finger squarely and unapologetically at a lot of generative linguistics for this. The emphasis in the Chomskyan paradigm on the supposed innateness of language, and hence the innateness of any kind of language disorder, really plays into societal rhetoric about language being an indicator of human worth. And so, I think people like Steven Pinker and Noam Chomsky might be very surprised that they are regarded by people in my generation as kind of part of the kind of conservative boogeyman. But it's for that reason that they are. Um, and so I think that's the first problem that's happened, is that we haven't acknowledged the way that society has really talked about someone's language use as being an indicator of their human worth. And that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say, which is also kind of a big issue, is that speech language pathologists really they don't serve society as a whole. We don't serve, or they don't serve, or it doesn't serve society as a whole. It's focused on facilitating those aspects of language that promote academic success and eventually vocational success, right? So for as much emphasis as there is on, for as much lip service as is paid to things like social communication and activities of daily living, people, the majority of work that SLPs do is justified by saying, well, children with communication disorders need to be successful in school, and communication disorders will hamper that. Or adults with acquired or congenital communication disorders need to be successful at work, and if they're not treated for these disorders, they won't be successful at work. And so it really ends up being kind of equating a person then with their ability to participate in an economy. And, if you think about the economy that we have right now, it's all service positions, right? There's not, really a place for labor and manufacturing, and those jobs that do exist are quite, low paid and socially disregarded. And so, I think speech language pathology as a field has allowed itself to become kind of the pawn of that way of thinking, of saying like, well, communication is valuable in as much as it, allows people to participate in the economy, or disorders are problematic because they prevent people from participating in the economy. And that's something that Joshua St. Pierre talks a lot about, and that's really influenced my thinking as well, that we're really not facilitating communication as speech language pathologists. We're enabling people to participate in the economy, and that's an important part of a person's life, right? I mean, being able to have a livelihood and participate in the economy is part of a person's life, but it's only one part, and we're not empowering people to change the way that societies are organized, and change the way that they and folks like them are viewed. So there, I promised you a brain dump, and I gave you one. I'll shut up now and wait for your
Oh no,
response.
no, no, it's great. It's great. So you know, just just listening to you, Ben. Like in terms of changing the whole paradigm of speech therapy, instead of how I mean, it really is an ongoing challenge to change people's perspectives, to change the people who stutters perspective as well,
Yeah.
because I mean, some some people who stutter, never 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 accept their stuttering. And to be honest, also I always have trouble with this word acceptance as well. So this is the key word, and but it is a lifetime challenge,
Yeah.
because I think there's still a lot of emphasis on speech therapy, on the physical characteristic of stuttering, the fluency, the speech mechanics. But I think where I feel, and it talks about the stuttering iceberg analogy by Dr. Sheen, that the emotional component is a huge factor in speech therapy. Sadly, it's often neglected. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that if you look across the Canada and the US, which are just the two, national contexts that you and I are in, I think there's quite a bit of diversity in the way that stuttering therapy takes place, right? Meaning perhaps what I'm about to say reflects my acquaintances and my colleagues, but I see a lot of disability affirming work in stuttering being done these days. Now, having said that, I am in a department that runs a camp for kids that stutter every summer that is focused very much on self-advocacy. I'm not sure acceptance is the word that they would use, but certainly sort of self-empowerment, right? Self-empowerment and self-advocacy. And so I'm fortunate to see that in the clinic associated with the department that I work in and that I led for 6 years as its chair. And I certainly know practitioners across the country that are in that same vein, but I think they're more specialists in fluency, and that a lot of the rank and file speech language pathologists do take the approach that you just described. Before I forget, I do want to say that you hate the F word that is fluency. I hate that word too, and I really hate it. I really hate it. And part of why I hate it is, it's one of the few terms in our discipline that is defined only by its absence. So if you ask somebody what fluency is, like the worst definition that you can give, the textbook definition, is the forward flow of speech. Well, what does that mean? I'm not talking backwards, right? So it's it's something that is defined by and large just by its absence, right? And so I hate that word. But I think part of the gap here is changing the way that graduate education happens, and really making sure that there is space in clinical education programs and speech language pathology to talk about exactly the issues that we're talking about right now, to invite people to imagine a different discipline and to think about what it would take to make that discipline work, right? I think people get so mired in the idea that, well, a third-party payer wouldn't approve that, or a school district wouldn't approve that, so we can't do it. And so people are letting their practice be driven by the institutions that are constraining them, right? It's like, you got to, at some point, you got to fight back. So I think part of it just begins in having graduate educations that center these kinds of issues, and that, excite students to be practitioners who are going to change the discipline, rather than just say, well, I guess this is what my job is, and I'm just going to do it, and, count down the years till retirement.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, I'm telling you. So Ben, what are your thoughts about I'd like to know your thoughts about honest speech. Now, what I mean by honest speech is I was born as a person who stutters, so it runs in the family. It's genetics. That's what I feel it's genetics, because my father stuttered, and I also have had four other brothers that stuttered.
Oh
So it runs,
my.
So it runs in the family. And so really, I mean, this is grounds I feel for genetics support, I should say. But anyhow, I mean, the more that I talk to people who stutter, the more I do research and whatever. But the term honest speech comes out a lot more recently. And what I mean by honest speech is I was born a person who stutters. Okay, I was born with stuttering. So my question to you now, and I haven't even answered the question myself. I'm struggling with this. So if my speech, if I was born with my stutter, if from birth, so is my speech, my stuttering, my honest speech? So if it is my honest speech, why would I want to change it?
Well, I mean, that last sentence is a very powerful one. If stuttering is your honest speech, why would you want to change it, right? And I think the hypothetical answer that I'm not advocating for would be if somebody said, well, because others expect you to change it, and your participation in society is dependent on you, doing what others expect of you, right? And in some very general sense, that's what people are told all the time. Like, it doesn't matter if you're attracted to members of the same sex. Society expects you to marry and have children with a member of the opposite sex, so that is what you'll do. I mean, that's what queer people were told for millennia, right? And and the experience you have as a person who stutters is probably the experience that folks have had for millennia as well, because stuttering is documented way back to antiquity. So I agree with that completely. I agree with that sense completely. Now, having said that, and I even got my right index finger. Now, as I say that, I do have to say that I think we're in kind of dangerous times right now, in that people are really embracing what folks sometimes call essentialism. And so essentialism is this notion that people, particularly groups of people who share a particular identity or trait. So you can think of people who share a racial identity, or people who share a sexuality or something, are that way only because it is sort of inevitably so. And, that kind of essentialism is, in society, really associated with a variety of negative behaviors and negative outcomes. So, for example, if people believe that men and women inevitably behave different ways based on the sex that was presumed to be their sex at birth, people who adhere to that notion that men and women are essentially different generally also really oppose any kind of progressive measures that would give greater access to men and women alike in different spheres of society. And so I guess what I'd say is, like, honest speech, I get it. And I think in this particular case, you're absolutely right. Like, why should you have to change everything about yourself just to meet an arbitrary and frankly unnecessary societal standard about speech fluency? At the same time, I think people need to be very cautious about embracing that kind of, sort of essentialist adjacent thinking. This is something I've been thinking a lot about, because I find myself at odds with others in, sort of activist communities, particularly activist communities around gender and sexuality, where behaviors aren't just innate or learned. Behaviors have a genetic basis that plays out differently in different societal contexts. My honest speech in this context is different from what my honest speech would be talking to my spouse in the next room, or talking to my students, or talking to my sister, right? I mean, I have many different types of honest speech, as do you as well, right? Yeah, this is, sorry, that was, I'm going on a tangent because you've hit a deep, you've hit a vein of thoughts that I have on this matter. So I'll be quiet again.
Oh, that's fine. Um, so while I was doing some research on your band, I came across a research paper that you're involved in, and this search was in the Journal of Critical Studies, and the name of the research is Accent Modification as a Raciolinguistic Ideology, a commentary in response to Buddha. And Buddha, am I pronouncing
Buddha,
it right?
yeah.
Buddha. And this was done in 2022. And so just read the the little summary of this for our listeners. And as I was saying, this is quite the mouthful just to say these words. But anyhow, it actually goes on to say that in this commentary, we collectively examine a recent article titled "Effectiveness of Intense Accent Modification Training with Refugees from Burma" by Burda. And whilst our response is aimed at revealing the theoretical and methodological shortcomings of Burda, it will also expose the racial linguistic ideologies in accent modification and highlight the need for careful ethical considerations of vulnerable populations such as refugees and asylum seekers. So when you're talking about the accent modification, it reminds me a lot of what we've been just talking about. Why should we change our honest speech? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Ben, would you share a little bit about this research paper? And,
Sure.
yeah. And first of all, why did you feel the need to challenge these findings?
Yeah. So this was an exercise sort of in collaborative scholarship. And so your readers should look up the paper because it has a list of authors that is quite long, longer than many papers. And so I do want to give incredible credit to Vishnu Nair, who was the first author of this paper and who, along with Betty Yu, really sort of rallied a group of people together to talk about this important issue. So to give you a little bit of background, there's been in speech-language pathology, particularly since the George Floyd murder, but certainly before then as well, there has been quite a bit of interest in pushing back on the way that speech-language pathology, at least in the US, has talked about accent modification. This idea that there should be one sort of standard way of speaking and that people who people whose ways of speaking don't resemble that should be, forced to change them to meet this. And so, this is the field of speech language pathology has advanced this practice without thinking really critically about what it means. What is the one way of speaking that is being upheld as sort of the standard, and why do we need this standard, right? And so that goes back to participation in the economy stuff that we talked about before. But anyway, there was a study that was published in the American Journal of Speech Language Pathology that talked about an intense accent modification program that was offered to recent Burmese refugees to, I think it was the Waterloo Cedar Falls area in Iowa. So a sort of small city in a small city in a red state, right? So a place where people who are refugees were vulnerable back then and are probably terribly vulnerable right now, given the barbaric policies of the current US administration. What struck us about this paper was that it was talking in sort of neutral scientific terms, and I put scientific in scare quotes here because I think science is and should be social, but neutral, asocial scientific terms about providing enormous amounts of accent modification to these people who were, recent refugees in a place that was unfamiliar to them, who are essentially being, told that they have to do all of this additional extra work to fit into this place that they, flee violence to get to. And so at some level, it just struck us as bizarre that people, so vulnerable were being discussed in such neutral terms. But I think it also raises the bigger question, which is really the crux of the commentary, and that is, well, who says people have to talk a particular way? Why that particular way? Who does that serve? And are we really as a society benefiting from this process of kind of enforcing everybody to speak a particular uniform way? So I think it very much calls back to the kinds of things that you are talking about in your lived experience as a person who stutters. Does that help? Did I miss anything here?
Oh no, that's that's fine. Ben, would you explain a few of the terms that I wasn't familiar with? And well, first of all, in the title it says racial linguistic ideology.
Yeah.
Well, how would you define that?
Well, I mean, so racial linguistic is a very current term in sociolinguistics right now, and I think there are people who are using it in ways that probably go far away from the way that it was originally conceived. And so, and so this is probably a question that's better for Vishnu or Betty, but my understanding of racial linguistic, keeping in mind that I'm probably one of the people contributing to the drift in the meaning of that term, is that it's a term that was devised to push back on this notion that you can talk about racialized varieties of language outside of talking about the power relationships among the groups of people who speak those languages and the racism that speakers of racialized varieties like African American language experience. So, a racial linguistic ideology is an ideology that casts a racialized variety of language, like African American language, as inherently inferior to a white coded variety of language, like the variety of language that I'm using right now.
Okay, okay. On page 108, there's a line here that I want you to clarify. And this this is on this is under the topic of racial linguistics ideologies. One is far away from the familiar anguish and worry about the future, but instead of receiving human centered trauma informed care, you are told you need to be fixed the way you speak, not because you need to, but to make white ears more comfortable with your tongue. Now that's quite something.
Yeah,
I mean
yeah.
that breeds ableism as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I should just say right now, I wish I knew I did not write that particular sentence. That to me, that sentence screams Betty you, or maybe Yvette Heider. I think Yvette Heider, Dr. Heider, is an author on this paper as well. And actually, I'm going to guess that that was an Yvette Heider line. But yes, I mean, this is kind of the you know. Let me just step back and I hope I'm not betraying my co-authors by saying this, but we initially submitted this paper to the American Journal of Speech Language Pathology, which is the journal that originally published the article that we were commenting on. And, they essentially rejected it outright and said, this is not, you couldn't find any empirical flaws with this article. Therefore, you have no reason to, you have no reason to write a letter to the editor about this. But, whether or not there were any empirical flaws in their statistics, I think that the sentence that you read just there, is part of the motivation for why we felt like we had to publish this, because, we were there. These are human beings, right? Human beings who are fleeing horrors, right? To come to a country that they thought was going to be safe, and immediately they're told, you're not really safe here as long as you speak a particular way, right? As long as you speak a particular way, you're not quite you don't quite belong here. And so unless you change to look to make yourself belong more here by speaking the way that the powerful people here speak, you really shouldn't be here, right? And that to me is just barbaric, right? It's just
Mm.
barbaric, right? Just as barbaric as it is to say the same thing to a kid who stutters, as perhaps happened to you. Just as barbaric as it was for the Canadian government to say to the First Nations people in Canada that you're not good enough as a human being. You have to go to these schools and learn how to be white, right?
Mm.
Right. I mean, these are acts of dehumanization, and they're acts of dehumanization that are perpetuated by the discipline of speech language pathology, and in a way that should give every speech language pathologist reason to stand up and say no. And so, I can't say that I wrote that line. I bet it was Hyder or you or Nyair, but boy, I'll co-sign it, and I'll co-sign it with a fist pump, right?
Mm.
And I'm actually really grateful that you read that line, because it's really hard in the US right now, and I think a lot of us are just thinking, like, how can we go on with this level of oppression? But then I read lines like that and I think, no, I am going to be the last one. It'll I'll stop doing this work when I'm dead, right? When I'm dead. When I'm dead.
Well,
So if they want me to stop doing the work, then I guess they're going to have to find a way to make me dead.
and well, you're doing great advocacy work, Ben. Excellent advocacy work. So we
Well,
need more people.
not as good as you.
and this article also challenges consent. This is a very vulnerable population,
Yeah, right.
and for this study to be done initially, what's going on here? It's like it's denying, as you mentioned earlier, that they're basing speech, how one communicates, as a human worth sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, let me just step back and play devil's advocate for the other side and say, so now I'm imagining being the authors of this article. Let me step back and say that the authors of this article would say, how dare you speak this way about me? I am a committed ethical speech language pathologist, and all I want to do is give these people the power to participate in the local society, participate in the local economy, have a make a living and have a good livelihood, etc. Right. So I think just to give them a place at the table, the response to that, their response would be something along the lines of that, I suspect. Right. And I think that we would push back on it and say, but what you're doing is you're putting all of the responsibility on the vulnerable individual to change themselves, rather than getting all of society together and saying, look, our society has changed. And because our society has changed, because we are not a uniform, homogenous society, we have to hold each other to a different set of expectations, including people with, majoritized identities and power, folks like me, need to be willing to do more to actively change my ways of being to accommodate the fact that I live in a society that has people that aren't just carbon copies of me. But just getting to this issue of consent, boy, if this isn't something I don't think about every single day. So as a member of the IRB, the ethics board, for 14 years now, including 7 years as the chair of one of its panels at my university, I think about consent all the time, right? And so if you have somebody who comes to the US who is coming from a refugee circumstance, who's coming to a place that they know nothing about, and who's being told this will help you here, that individual just has to sort of rely on the person in front of them to give them honest information, and it's not really clear to me that that's a circumstance where people can honestly, authentically consent to participation. Right. Now, I'm not saying that the study was done unethically, right? I'm sure that it met the ethics requirements of whatever, institutional review board covered it. But I'm saying that, there are the federal regulations on research, and then there are more general ethical concerns, right? And I think that when we think about something that is as essentially human as language, we need to really be delicate in the way that we talk about it and think about it. We need to be especially careful not to essentialize it the way that we've been talking about for 20 minutes now.
There's so much to talk about in this research paper, but another line stands out as well, and I'll read this. Raciolinguistic ideologies perpetuates an idealized view of English monolingualism. I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure.
No, you're pronouncing it perfectly.
The language of speakers of color, the deviate from the Eileen's version is racializing and labeled as deviant. Through these, individuals are engaged in linguistic practices normative to their community. What are your thoughts about that sentence?
Well, I mean, my thoughts about that sentence are that it really makes me smile, and so I'm trying to remember who wrote that one. I'm going to give that one to Betty or Vishnu.
Oh no, this is Flora and Rosa.
Oh, this is a Flores and Rosa. Oh, so this is it. Yeah. Yeah, Flores and Rosa, who are the ones who devised this term, right? And I didn't say their names before because I was really worried I was going to get them wrong. So, so this is, I think that's the definition of racial linguistic ideology. That's the textbook definition that its creators gave. So contrast that with the one that I attempted to give before, right? But I think that's sort of the essence of thinking about language variation across racial identities in terms of a raciolinguistic lens, rather than just thinking about it as, different varieties of a language. Because, when you look at the history of, all countries, it's easy to talk about the US here because the US, because of the history of U.S. and its enslavement, kidnapping and enslavement of African peoples. But this happens all over the world and at different times in history. This idea that groups that have a particular identity are forcibly brought in or ejected from a particular place, and then every attribute of that group is sort of regarded as an indicator of their reduced value, right? So, talking about the language of Black folks in the U.S. is inherently inferior is, a way to reinforce the idea, that reinforce the status of white people as being more worthy of a disproportionate share of resources and a disproportionate access to power.
Definitely, definitely. So,
Yeah, just like folks who stutter, right? Like, I mean, when you think about it in terms of your own life, I mean, it's the very same thing could be said about folks who stutter. Like someone who stutters, whose honest speech is their stuttering. It's an easy way for someone who doesn't stutter to say, all right, you know what, Greg doesn't even get to be in the competition. Greg can't compete with me for a share of resources because Greg stutters, and that means that he is worth inherently less as a human being, right? It's the same ideology that would dehumanize people who stutter, and that, one of the reasons why during times of genocide, for example, people with disabilities are especially vulnerable, as was certainly true in the European genocide, that was mostly of the Jews, but also of disabled and queer folks in the 30s and 40s, and the various genocides happening today.
Ben, what was the response to this, this research challenge by you and the other people involved? What was the response? Curious. What response?
I mean, I think the response was, enthusiastic adulation from people who already felt the same way, right? Speech language pathology as a field is very insular and really circles the wagons. And so I think the response has been sort of crickets, right? Like, the people who have committed themselves to bettering the world and sort of using and in this particular way. So thinking about, sort of dismantling linguistic white supremacy we're quite happy to see a paper that illuminated these issues. Having said that, I mean, for me personally, I think as someone who had a very traditionally prestigious research career early on, looking at relationships between vocabulary growth and speech sound development in children with and without communication disorders, as someone whose work spanned linguistics and speech language pathology and psychology, I think people look at me and think, oh, is your research career going to continue to go on a downward trajectory, or now that you're not chair, are you going to, sort of ramp it up again? So I think, for my colleagues who are, more sort of invested in their power and prestige, I think this is seen as sort of like well, why would you want to do that, right? I mean, that's not prestigious. So, that's why your listeners will not have heard the bio that I sent to you, but it had a lot of instances of the F word, not fluency, the other one. And, part of the reason so before our chat, you said, Ben, why are you so angry and cynical? And part of the reason why I'm angry and cynical is because, I feel like I'm doing the most important work that I've ever done in my career, and the hardest work that I've ever done in my career.
Okay. But I mean, so is there an up from there?
I mean, I think right now we're in crisis mode because there's such an active, focused attack on the most fundamental aspects of society and, sort of educated, progressive society. And so right now, I think we're all in sort of siege mentality. Now, having said that, I think that that this is the good thing about a siege mentality is that it rallies people together in ways that can form new coalitions and can make work that might have seemed in other times to be sort of niche work seem much more vital, which it is. It's much more vital, right? So I think there definitely is an upside, but it's work, right? And it's not a matter of copying and pasting an email and sending it to the the head of ASHA or the Canadian Audiology and Speech Pathology Association and saying, there, I did an activism. It's a matter of for speech language practitioners actively changing their practice, and for activists and advocates and academics to really put themselves on the line to advocate these ways of thinking and acting and teaching and doing as vitally necessary for our survival as a discipline and as a species. I'm blessed to be in speech language pathology, which is a deeply problematic profession, but it's also a profession that is ripe for changing people's minds about this thing, language, that is so fundamentally who we are. And, as long as I'm in a position where people are going to be listen to me, even if it's progressively fewer and fewer and fewer, it's still going to be what I'm going to say. Call me Cassandra, because I got to say the truth.
Ben, I'm really in awe with the work that you're doing, the advocacy work. So,
but Greg, the work that you do in your daily life and in living unapologetically, and in testifying. Sorry, you can tell also that I'm actually weirdly quite religious, and so I use a lot of religious metaphors. And you'll see actually this rhetorical style that I'm using is very much from my grandpa Munson, who was like a tent preacher, literally. Tent revival preacher, right? And so I will just say, your daily life, Greg, is a testimony to the power of moving past the kind of oppressive ableist ideologies that have been, the norm for hundreds of years. So you're a living, breathing example of what liberation looks like. And that's why when you started out with your description of the podcast, I was this close to crying and I was like, I can't cry at the beginning of this, because that's what it's all about, Greg. I'm so sorry that I'm not there to give you a big, big warm hug, right? Because I honor you.
Thanks a lot for saying that, Ben. Thank you.